Imagine discovering that thousands of Soviet oil trains, enough to store 1 million tons of crude, simply vanished from government ledgers as the Soviet Union broke apart. The official records froze in 1991, yet experts today cannot agree on what happened next. Were these tankers truly abandoned or purposefully hidden from history? The answer leads us straight into the chaos that followed the Soviet Union's collapse and reveals why this industrial ghost fleet is an unsolved puzzle with consequences that still haunt a continent. Railways formed the arteries of the Soviet Union, stretching more than 87,000 miles across 11 time zones. Every day, trains hauled crude oil from the frozen fields of western Siberia to refineries and ports thousands of kilometers away. The scale was staggering. By the late 1980s, rail handled the majority of inland crude, moving millions of tons each year, more than any single pipeline network could manage. In the heart of this system stood the Ministry of Railways, a vast bureaucracy with a single, centralized ledger tracking every tanker, every engine, every depot. Oil depots dotted the landscape from Tyumen in the west to Vladivostok in the east, each acting as a node in a carefully choreographed ballet. Some depots held hundreds of tankers at a time, each car engineered to withstand Arctic cold, permafrost, and the punishing loads demanded by Soviet planners. The numbers were immense. A single major depot could process up to 10,000 tons of oil per day, with entire sidings reserved just for strategic stockpiles. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union's energy planners relied on meticulous records. Every movement was logged in ledgers kept under lock and key in Moscow. Even the smallest sidings in the far north were tracked, with daily updates sent by telegraph or phone. The ministry's records were a marvel of centralized control, one that Western intelligence analysts struggled to penetrate even as satellites captured glimpses of endless trains winding through the taiga. The workforce behind this behemoth was just as vast. Depot managers, engineers, and yard workers operated around the clock. In Omsk, a crew chief might oversee 20 men during a single shift, each one responsible for checking valves, monitoring pressure, and keeping the flow of oil uninterrupted. The air inside these depots was thick with the smell of crude and coal dust. Fire buckets lined the platforms, a reminder that a single spark could spell disaster. During winter, workers braved -40 degrees to keep the tankers moving, sometimes sleeping in their overalls between shifts. This system was more than just steel and oil. It was a symbol of Soviet ambition and control, a logistical machine built to serve the needs of a superpower. Every train, every ton, every kilometer was accounted for, until the day the ledgers stopped being updated. What happened next would unravel the certainty that had defined Soviet rail for generations. In December 1991, the Ministry of Railways received its final budget directive from Moscow. Overnight, the flow of funds that had kept the world's largest oil transport network running simply stopped. Regional dispatchers in Tyumen, Omsk, and Krasnoyarsk opened their ledgers to find columns with no new entries, invoices that would never be paid, and maintenance orders left unsigned. For decades, every train had been accounted for by a paper trail stretching back to the capital. Now those trails ended abruptly, sometimes mid-sentence, as if the story of each train had been cut off by an unseen hand. Within days, depot managers began sending urgent telegrams, first to Moscow, then to each other. The messages grew more frantic. Entire trains were missing from the latest inventory lists with no explanation. Yard chiefs in the far north reported dozens of tankers parked at sidings that no longer existed on official maps. In the west, station masters discovered that their requests for fuel and spare parts were bouncing back, marked as undeliverable. The centralized system that once tracked every axle and valve had fractured into silence. By the end of January 1992, the ministry's mainframe in Moscow showed gaps that could not be reconciled. Oil tankers listed as in transit had vanished from the network. Others appeared twice, assigned to different depots hundreds of kilometers apart. Some dispatchers, fearing accusations of theft, quietly altered their local logs to match what little information they had, erasing the last traces of trains that had physically never left their yards. In the chaos, the true number of missing tankers became impossible to pin down. The first internal alarm cables circulated among senior officials, warning that the rolling stock inventory was no longer reliable. With the Soviet Union's collapse, the boundaries of ownership blurred overnight. Regional authorities, now cut off from Moscow's oversight, began to treat the trains in their territory as assets to be claimed, traded, or simply ignored. As privatization loomed and new power brokers circled, the once orderly world of Soviet oil logistics dissolved into confusion. The disappearance of entire fleets went unnoticed in the noise of a collapsing superpower, setting the stage for a battle over ownership that would soon turn violent. In the first months after the Soviet collapse, the idea of ownership became a riddle no one could solve. On paper, every citizen was handed a voucher, an official slip representing a sliver of the nation's wealth. From 1992 to 1994, these vouchers flooded the country, promising ordinary people a stake in the future. In practice, the system unraveled almost immediately. Most citizens, desperate for cash or simply confused by the rules, sold their vouchers for a fraction of their supposed value. In smoky kitchens and on street corners, stacks of vouchers changed hands, often for a bag of groceries or a few rubles. Meanwhile, a new class of insiders, regional managers, well-connected officials, and shadowy intermediaries quietly gathered thousands of vouchers. They understood the real game. The auctions were coming, and control would not go to the highest bidder, but to those who knew how to bend the rules. In Siberia, a regional auction for a cluster of oil transport assets was announced with barely a week's notice. The location was a drafty municipal hall in a remote town far from Moscow's oversight. Most locals never heard about it. The winning bid came from a shell company registered days earlier, fronted by a former depot manager and funded by a flood of purchased vouchers. The price paid was a fraction of the rolling stock's book value. An entire train depot and hundreds of tankers were transferred for what amounted to pocket change. The consequences became clear as the paper trail diverged from reality. Officially, thousands of citizens now owned shares in oil transport companies scattered across the country. In reality, physical control rested with those who controlled the depots and the men with the keys. A scholar studying the process later wrote that privatization was designed to distribute wealth, but it only redistributed confusion and opportunity for the bold. On the ground depot, managers who had survived the first wave of chaos now answered to new, often invisible owners. Some were told to keep the trains running until further notice. Others were quietly instructed to lock the gates and wait for new orders. In many cases, the tankers themselves never moved. They sat on sidings, their fate determined not by market forces or public ownership, but by the shifting alliances of regional power brokers. The auctions had created a world where legal title and physical possession rarely matched. A citizen in Moscow might hold a certificate for a share of a Tumen oil transport company, but the actual tankers could be under the control of a local official, a private security firm, or a new company registered in a neighboring republic. The ledgers no longer matched the landscape. What followed was a legal and logistical deadlock that would haunt the railways for years to come. By 1995, the chaos of privatization took on a new face. The government, desperate for cash, turned to the loans for shares scheme, a plan that handed control of entire industries to a handful of banks. These banks, often run by men with deep political connections, were tasked with auctioning off state assets. In practice, the auctions resembled closed-door negotiations more than public sales. Notices appeared in obscure newspapers or on bulletin boards in distant towns, sometimes just days before the event. Attendance lists read like a roll call of insiders, while ordinary citizens, still clutching their privatization vouchers, found themselves locked out of the process. In one case, a regional bank in Omsk announced an auction for a cluster of oil transport assets. The event took place in the back room of a municipal building, with only 3 bidders present. All were subsidiaries of the same holding company, itself controlled by the bank managing the auction. The winning bid was a fraction of the fleet's book value, hundreds of tankers, and the rights to several depots, transferred with a single signature. The paperwork was rushed. A legal archivist later recalled that entire dockets vanished from the courthouse within weeks. Arbitration files, once kept under lock and key, simply disappeared. In some regions, the only surviving records were handwritten notes in personal diaries, or faded carbon copies in forgotten drawers. This was not an isolated incident. Across the country, auctions for railway assets played out in similar fashion. Titles changed hands on paper, but the physical trains remained parked in the same yards, their fate decided by whoever controlled the local security forces. In Tumen, a former depot manager found his name removed from ownership documents, replaced by a shell company registered in Cyprus. When he tried to contest the transfer, the court informed him that the case file no longer existed. In Moscow, a legal scholar reviewing post-Soviet asset transfers noted that the registry for rolling stock had more gaps than entries by 1996. The confusion extended across borders. Some trains, stranded in what was now Kazakhstan or Ukraine, became the subject of diplomatic notes and border disputes. Ownership claims crossed lines that no longer matched the maps, pitting regional authorities against newly independent states. In a few cases, tankers listed as assets of Russian firms were discovered on sidings in Central Asia, their titles claimed by local governments or quietly leased to private traders. The result was a web of overlapping claims, lost registries, and legal dead ends that no one could unravel. For the oligarchs who navigated this maze, the rewards were immense. Control over a single depot or a fleet of tankers meant access to lucrative oil flows, export licenses, and leverage in political negotiations. But for everyone else, ordinary shareholders, local managers, even government officials, the system became a labyrinth with no exit. As one archivist put it, the records are gone. The trains are there, but the law has no memory. By the end of the decade, the legal tangle surrounding these assets had become so dense that even the state struggled to assert control. The missing registries and vanished arbitration files made it nearly impossible to prove ownership or responsibility. What began as a scramble for wealth had solidified into a permanent state of ambiguity, with tankers and depots scattered across the former Soviet landscape, each one a silent witness to a chapter of history no one could fully reconstruct. The abandoned tankers, scattered across sidings from Tumen to Vladivostok, face a technical barrier that makes their return to service nearly impossible. Soviet railways were built to the 1,520mm broad gauge, a standard that locks these cars out of most European and Chinese networks, which run on the narrower 1,435mm track. Each car is fitted with the SA3 automatic coupler, a Soviet innovation designed for heavy loads and harsh climates, but incompatible with the Western Janney or Willison systems. Attempts to retrofit these tankers for export or reuse would require not just new wheel sets, but a complete overhaul of the undercarriage and coupling gear, a process more expensive than building new cars from scratch. Material fatigue adds another layer of difficulty. The JOST steel used in these tankers was engineered for subarctic conditions, but decades of exposure have taken a toll. Former depot engineers describe how, by the late 1990s, corrosion had already eaten through weld seams and tank linings. Oil residue and water trapped inside the cars accelerated rust, especially in regions where permafrost cycles cause tanks to expand and contract each season. Ultrasonic tests in Omsk and Krasnoyarsk depots found microfractures in more than half of the cars surveyed. By the time salvage became an option, the structural integrity of most tankers was already compromised, turning the once mighty fleet into a graveyard of rusted steel and leaking joints. Physical reuse is not just impractical, it is a technical dead end. Oil residue left inside the abandoned tankers has turned to thick sludge, clinging to the walls and pooling at the bottom of rusted shells. In places like Vyivakana, where oil shale trains once ran non-stop, environmental field teams now collect samples from puddles seeping out beneath the wheels. Each spring, as the Siberian permafrost thaws, the ground shifts and cracks, splitting open tank seams that were never meant to sit idle for decades. Dark stains spread slowly across the tundra, mixing with meltwater and vanishing into the moss. Local scavengers roam the yards, stripping copper wire and steel plates with hand tools, sometimes working by flashlight to avoid patrols. They wear masks against the fumes, but the air is heavy with the stench of hydrocarbons. Official memos from the Ministry of Defense insist the fleet remains a strategic reserve, off-limits to salvage or sale, even as the evidence of neglect piles up. Environmental non-governmental organizations, armed with field cameras and sample kits, document everything: broken valves, leaking domes, oily fingerprints on the snow. Yet no one claims responsibility for the mess. Regional officials blame Moscow, and Moscow blames the regions. The tankers sit in silence, caught between the threat of reactivation and the reality of slow-motion decay. For now, the only certainty is the spreading stain beneath the wheels, and the knowledge that each year, the problem grows harder to ignore. Today, rusting tankers leak quietly into Siberian soil. It is an unresolved crisis, as Russia remains the world's second-largest oil producer. The legacy of abandoned infrastructure is not just a relic. It is an urgent environmental hazard with no owner, no cleanup, and no accountability. As oil demand and ecological risks collide, these forgotten trains force us to confront who pays for history's unfinished business. What responsibility will future generations inherit? Share your thoughts below.